An Aggie does not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. We belted this out, a group of sweaty freshmen in white t-shirts and jeans, standing at a close resemblance to the position of attention on a concrete parade deck in the Texas heat, barely louder than the upperclassmen cadets who were yelling at us to yell louder. Earlier in the afternoon, those same upperclassmen had smiled and chatted with our parents as they very graciously carried our luggage to our rooms, knowing that when they drove away, the fourth class system would commence. We were being initiated into the Corps of Cadets, a senior military college like VMI and the Citadel. Some of us had plans to commission into the military, and others, like me, were just doing it for the heck of it. But everyone now was no longer a freshman, but a fish. It was not a fish privilege to have a first name. I was just Fish Seelman that year. It wasn't a fish privilege to have a room. Fish live in holes, after all. It was not a fish privilege to think, only to cogitate. It was not a fish privilege to feel, no similar concept offered. It was a fish privilege to memorize long quotations from the different statues on campus, which were called campusologies. And it was a fish privilege to yell them out at full volume whenever prompted. And the first and most important of these campusologies was the honor system, the Aggie Honor Code. An Aggie does not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. At the time, it seemed simple and noble enough, but those who made it past that first week had 4 years to see its many different expressions and eccentricities. That first afternoon, we didn't know each other. We were alone, me and my fish class, and quickly, out of necessity, the other most important thing we learned was that one of the only privileges we had left was unity. No fish could survive the fourth class system alone. There was power in sticking together. But this also came with consequences. Fish Seelman, did you shine your shoes this morning? To answer, sir, no, sir, you were incompetent and had to do push-ups, along with your whole class for failing you. Ma'am, yes, ma'am, well then you were obviously lying, a worse offense, you're breaking the Aggie Honor Code, and then you were subjected to individual scrutiny. You had two choices: boof your buddies, as we called it, or be considered a weak link alone. Because on some level, the truth didn't really matter to the upperclassmen when they asked that question. It was a test to see if you had the power to persevere in a system in which you knew you couldn't win, but could fail together or wash out alone. Would it surprise you to say it was great fun in retrospect? Because truth has power. Truth is an expression of power. And that power is always lodged in communities of otherwise powerless people. Eventually, you start to have some fun with it. You start pranking your upperclassmen, duct tape the button on a shaving cream can and throw it into your sophomore's room in the dead of night, and then bar the exit with a mattress, stowing reams of student newspapers and then filling them in your seniors' rooms. You could take back a little bit of power with the freedom you had outside the rules. You learn the power of omission and half-truth, and not stealing, but maybe negotiating the speedy return of upperclassmen property for some more privileges. In later years, though, the consequences became more severe. Do you admit to the honor court that your buddy wasn't attending classes or sleeping through formation or going a little overboard with making the freshmen do push-ups? Because the power of truth isn't just lodged in one community, but many different communities that clash and compete for our loyalty. We have an interesting relationship to truth in our age. Our Reformed church tradition is largely the product of certain truths being called into question. And you might say this seemed to start an irreversible spiral complicating the power of truth. This has its own virtue because truth has power, and challenging truths challenges the way that unjust power works. But this always comes with consequence because we struggle to have a shared sense of truth in our time. We struggle to have a shared loyalty to power. And truth be told, we struggle to find a shared sense of reality. It's often said in politics that we should all be able to agree on what the problems are, or at least the facts of the matter. We just disagree about the solutions. But the past decade feels topsy-turvy in the realization that this is not quite so. Reality and truth always have to do with power and the power to craft different truths, using and misusing our human freedom to choose and to believe and to act. Some look at the confusion and active deception and worry that we live in a post-truth moment. Still others hold on to any shred of truth they can and proclaim that facts don't care about your feelings. We want to believe there's virtue in proclaiming the truth, even when it's unpalatable, no matter the consequence. And we find a similar dissonance here in our reading from the Acts of the Apostles. We can find many truths in this text, but almost to a disorienting degree. We'd struggle to come up with any hard and fast rules from it, anything to really hang our hats on. In fact, we might just instead be left downright horrified by it. A couple in the early Jewish church, Ananias and Sapphira, they see their comrades selling all their land and laying the proceeds at the feet of the apostles. And they decide to sell their land too, but they just hold back some of the proceeds. This passage isn't really about the question of private property, but it's important to attend to those issues too, because you can imagine how this might read to those who just give and give and give without return. Those people who can't even trust in their own motives because they're wrapped up in an abusive reality where what they give is never enough because they are never enough. But we're reminded that this incident comes after the church has been visited and empowered by the Holy Spirit, not just once, but for a second time. Even though they've been threatened by the religious establishment, it says they've received blessings. It says an abundance of grace was at work among them all. This has echoes that go back to the time when the people of Israel were in the wilderness in the book of Joshua. In that book, the Israelites faced destruction against their enemies because they set aside possessions that were supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, but they put them among their own possessions. God says God will no longer be with them until they consecrate those things anew. Because to set these possessions aside in the first place is to admit that God is set aside, that God is holy. So this text is not so much about possessions, though that's a truth for another day. It's not even really about the existence of God. It's about God's reality, God's truth. For the first church, this meant holding on to the God of Israel, who gives grace freely. And God's grace is so radically holy that God works even in the truth of our own freedom. And that freedom always comes with temptation. Our first reading is the temptation of Christ in the Gospel of Luke, which is an unlikely companion to this passage. In that passage, the devil meets a starving, fasting human Jesus and tempts him with never having to deal with human hunger, with never having to obey human powers, with never suffering a worldly death. And when Christ denies those temptations, the devil departs. But it says only until the next opportunity. Now in Acts, the devil reappears. This is an alien first contact of the power of Satan with the Spirit-filled early church. Peter sees this for what it is, and he asks Ananias, Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? The temptation of Christ laid bare how the eternal Son of God joined herself to human flesh, and the entrance of Satan here lays bare the deeper reality of Holy Spirit joined to the church. But this won't be enough to tell us who that Spirit really is. Because unlike Christ, we can fail. God is Spirit. God is made of Spirit. God's a spiritual being beyond being. But to know that the Holy Spirit joined to the church is truly and fully God, in the same way that Jesus and the way that the Father are God, means to know that the Spirit can defeat death, that the Spirit has power over death. The result is terrifyingly death. And just because the Apostle Peter speaks. Or maybe the reality of the Spirit asserted itself, exposed an already existing reality of death. This leaves the community afraid, quaking in their boots. This text shows just how at odds this reality is from our own. This reality doesn't sound familiar to us, or at least we hope not. Perhaps it's a literary feature, a taste of dramatic irony, but we're not really laughing at the punchline. This is the problem with the book of Acts. It more closely captures our reality as the church compared to any other book in the Bible. But the truth is, it's still a different reality. The Jewish apostles who knew Jesus for themselves are no longer here with us. We remember that we're just a fish cast in the nets of those apostles. We'd struggle to find them or their power here, just as we might struggle to find the Spirit powerfully present in our own lives. And this leaves us equally terrified. But this passage gives us hints. It tells us where we are to look to see this Spirit who is God in our lives. After Ananias and Sapphira both drop dead, young men come to wrap up their bodies. This, one commenter notes, is very similar to another passage. So we go back to Joshua, the Israelites in the wilderness entering the promised land. The character Rahab helps Israelite spies escape from the city of Jericho. She says she knows the land is given to them and that her people have become afraid because of their presence. So she says, I will be loyal to you, even though I'm not one of your people. Then later, after the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, it says that young men come, not to take away the dead, but to take her and all who belong to her, all her kindred, and set them outside the camp of Israel. It says that they live among the Israelites even to this day in the promised land. This terrifying incident, this terrifying freedom, sets the stage for Gentiles, like most of us, to be included here in the first place, to worship this God who is powerful and holy and radically free, and gives us the radical freedom to say yes. And this doesn't happen without some slippage, without some cognitive dissonance, without some fear. One body can't stand in for another body without all that. Gentiles can't enter the story of Israel without some confusion or even fear. Resident aliens, even in our own land. It still remains difficult to know who to listen to or what to believe in this day. Which communities should really claim our loyalty? But this passage tells us that God's reality is the realest one of all. God's community is the most powerful of all. And so God's power, working in just a word of truth, a choice for community and intimacy and care, is the greatest truth there is, the greatest power there is, more powerful than any other worldly power or religious leader or even death. Because God's reality is life, life that conquers death. And we live in this reality, even to this day outside the camp. The novelist Pat Conroy wrote the book The Lords of Discipline, based on his own experience at the Citadel, another senior military college. They've got the same honor system, interestingly enough. And when I read it, sometimes it speaks more to my reality at A&M, even more than my own experiences there. And the character based on Conroy, Will McLean, is an unremarkable cadet who lectures to that year's freshmen about the honor system. He tells them if the Institute is indeed something special, then the code is the central fact of that specialness. The Institute does not give you a choice about whether you wish to be honorable or not. The code is imposed upon you for your 4 years at the Institute. It is the written moral manifesto of how you'll behave. When you graduate, the code goes with you, and the code lives as long as you live. But then for McLean, speaking to the freshmen, this doesn't quite feel right. As I spoke, I began to feel rather foolish as I faced the inert artillery of their stunned, botanized gazes. Over and over again, I repeated the word honor until it became like a pulse beat of my speech. The abstraction defeated me, strangled me in its maddening inexpressibility. It was like describing the hierarchy of the Trinity. I could feel myself struggle with a game and ardent inarticulateness as I tried to explain the concept of honor to the staggered, uncomprehending mass of boys who shivered in the air conditioning below me. I sounded like a minor character, flawed and cheaply produced operetta who delivers charmingly absurd recitations that have no meaning. The freshmen now listened to me with resolute grimness. They listened because they feared me as the moment's appointed embodiment of the system. They had laughed at my jokes at the beginning of the speech, but their laughter was so joyless and forced that it depressed rather than elated me. They laughed because I was a member of the cadre, not because they thought I was a hoot. That hurt. I'd made a minor career out of being a hoot. It was an odd feeling to be feared, and it was an even odder one to like it. The difference between this and God's reality, friends, is that we're given a choice. Our honor is not prescribed, and that choice is precisely where God is at work. It's a freedom, the only real freedom, to say yes to this God of Israel, who shouldn't be ours but will have us anyway. To say yes to life in community that brings life and not death, joy and not fear, truth and not deception. Thanks be to God.